The Marrow Spring Ranch had once been known for two things: cold water and horses that could cross 30 miles of bad country without quitting. By August of 1883, folks near Mesilla only whispered about the third thing, the screaming behind the locked gate. Most people blamed fever, or grief, or the hard season. That was easier than admitting a family was breaking a young woman in broad daylight, while every decent man in the county found a reason to keep riding. Her name was Lydia Marrow. She was 22 years old, and the first time Caleb Rourke saw her, she was face down beside a water trough, trying to push herself out of the dirt with hands that would not stop shaking. Her sisters called it weakness. Her brother-in-law called it discipline. Caleb Rourke called it by its proper name: theft. Caleb had not meant to stop at Marrow Spring Ranch. That was what he told himself later. His bay gelding was blown from the heat, his canteen was nearly empty, and the road south toward Mesilla shimmered like hammered tin under the noon sun. The ranch sat low against a line of cottonwoods, with a whitewashed house, a sagging barn, and a gate chained shut from the inside. A strange thing for a ranch with good water. Two hired hands stood near the corral, pretending to mend a harness. Neither one looked at the house. Neither one looked at the woman in the yard. That told Caleb more than any confession could have. Then he heard her cry out. Not loud, not dramatic, just one thin sound from somebody who had already learned that nobody was coming. Caleb reined his horse outside the gate. Through the dust he saw Lydia Marrow in a pale dress, stained brown at the knees and shoulder. One sleeve was torn. Her blonde hair hung across her cheek. Her right ankle had swollen so badly the boot would not sit straight. A heavy man stood over her with a paper in one hand and a revolver on his belt. Silas Creed, 35 or so, red-faced, well-fed, boots too polished for a man who claimed to work cattle. The kind of man who learned early that cruelty sounds less like cruelty when you say it calmly. Two women watched from the porch. Ruth and Clara Marrow, Lydia's sisters. Neither one looked surprised. That was the ugliest part. "Sign it," Silas said. Lydia tried to lift herself with one elbow. Her ankle buckled, and she fell back into the dust beside the trough. "I already gave you the south horses," she whispered. Silas crouched near her. "And now you'll give me the spring." Clara stepped off the porch with a little leather document folder clutched to her chest. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Lydia," she said. "A woman alone can't hold a ranch. Everybody knows that." One of the hired hands stared down at the harness until his fingers shook. Caleb looked at the paper, a land office seal, Mesilla County, transfer of water access and grazing claim. Then he looked at the drag marks running from the porch steps to the trough. Somebody had pulled Lydia across the yard like a sack of feed. The paper was not the crime. It was just the part they wanted recorded. He grabbed a fistful of Lydia's hair and lifted her face. "Your father left you this place because he was too sick to think straight," he said, "not because you deserved it." Lydia spat blood into the dust near his boot. For half a second, Caleb almost smiled. Then Silas struck her hard enough to turn her face sideways. Caleb told himself to stay out of it. He had told himself that in mining camps, border towns, freight yards, and jail offices from Santa Fe to El Paso, it had kept him alive, mostly. But the lie would not hold in that yard. The gate creaked open. Everyone turned. rode in slowly, black hat low, coat bleached by years of sun, old rifle tied under the saddle flap, one Colt resting low at his hip. Silas stood. "This ain't your business." Caleb stopped beside the trough and looked down at Lydia. Up close, she looked worse, bruising at the collarbone, a split lip. Fear settled so deep in her eyes it looked older than she was. But she had not begged. Caleb respected that. He raised his eyes to Silas. "She signing?" he asked, "or dying?" No one answered. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Silas stepped closer. "You better ride on, old man." Caleb looked at the document folder in Clara's hand, then at Lydia, trying to breathe through the pain, then back at Silas. "Most thieves," Caleb said, "wait until the owner can stand before stealing the floor under her." Silas reached for his revolver. Bad choice. Nobody saw Caleb draw. Silas screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his right hand as the revolver spun into the dust beside the trough. The horses in the corral exploded against the rails. Ruth shrieked. Clara dropped the folder. One hired hand ducked behind a wagon. Caleb's voice never rose. "Next one takes the elbow." Then he climbed down from his horse, slowly, carefully, like a man who had done too many violent things to enjoy one more. He crouched beside Lydia. "Can you stand if I help you?" She tried to answer. Pain caught the words first. Caleb slid one arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her carefully. She weighed less than a grown woman ought to. Silas stared from beside the trough, blood running between his fingers, hatred boiling behind his eyes. But underneath the hatred was something colder, fear, because for the first time that summer, somebody had opened the locked gate and refused to look away. The ride into Mesilla took longer than it should have. Not because the road was rough, because Lydia could barely stay upright in the saddle. Caleb kept the horse moving at a walk, while she clutched the saddle horn with both hands. Twice, she nearly slid sideways. The third time, he stopped pretending not to notice, and rode beside her with one steadying hand near her back. Neither of them spoke for a mile. Sometimes silence is kinder than questions. Mesilla sat dusty and half awake in the afternoon heat. Wagons moved along the plaza. A blacksmith hammered at an iron rim. Men laughed outside the cantina, as if the world had not just shown its teeth a few miles north. That always made evil look worse to Caleb. How ordinary everything stayed around it. Dr. Abel Kern kept a narrow clinic behind a feed store. He was old, dry, and sharp-eyed, with tobacco stains on 2 fingers and spectacles he never seemed to clean. And Lydia's ankle in a back room while Caleb waited near the window. When the doctor finished, he tied the bandage tight and muttered, "She'll keep the foot." Lydia closed her eyes. "But if somebody drags her around again," the doctor added, "that ankle will heal crooked." Caleb's jaw tightened. Dr. Kern saw the bruises on Lydia's wrists. He did not ask. Frontier doctors learned early that some truths entered the room already bleeding. When the doctor stepped out, Caleb handed Lydia a tin cup of water. Her fingers trembled too hard to hold it. He steadied the cup without making a ceremony of it. That embarrassed her more than the injury. "You don't need to do that," she whispered. Caleb said, "I know." She looked at him. "Then why?" "Because I already started." For the first time since leaving the ranch, Lydia almost smiled. Almost. Outside, a train whistle carried across the hot air from the freight siding east of town. Lydia turned toward the sound. "My father used to say a spring is worth more than a house," she said. Caleb leaned by the window. He was right. He built Marrow Spring before I was born. Not big, not fancy, but the water never failed, even in dry years. That was the first real peace. Caleb could feel it. Land was one kind of greed. Water was another, in a man's hunger. Lydia spoke slowly, not crying, not begging, just placing one truth after another where someone might finally see them. Her father, Josiah Marrow, had left the ranch mostly to her because she knew how to run it. She kept the water records. She knew which pasture could carry cattle through drought. She knew which mares threw strong colts. She knew the accounts better than any clerk in town. Her sisters had left years before. Ruth married Silas Creed. Clara followed gamblers from camp to camp until luck grew tired of her. But after Josiah died, they came home, wearing black dresses and soft voices. That lasted 13 days. Then the locks changed. The ranch hands were dismissed. Food disappeared from Lydia's room, and Silas began setting documents on the table every morning. He kept saying no judge would let a young woman hold a water claim alone, Lydia said. Caleb snorted. Men love saying the law agrees with them before the law has spoken. Then Lydia lowered her voice. My father knew Silas would try something. Caleb looked at her. There are papers hidden at the ranch. What kind of papers? The real will, a water ledger, and an account book showing Silas borrowed against our spring without my father's consent. Caleb turned fully from the window. Now the shape was clear. Not a family quarrel, a stolen ranch. A stolen water right. A debt dressed up as concern. Who held the debt? Caleb asked. Lydia hesitated. Horace Venn. Caleb knew the name. A land broker with an office near the rail line. Clean vest, silver watch, hands soft as a preacher's lies. He had been buying narrow strips of land across the territory, wherever track surveyors might soon need water. Steam engines drank plenty. So did cattle drives. And a reliable spring could make poor land valuable overnight. Where are the papers? Caleb asked. In the spring house, behind a loose stone, under the pump shelf. Caleb looked back through the clinic window. Across the street, a man on a gray horse sat too still in the shade of the livery, watching the door, watching Lydia. Caleb reached for his hat. You tell anybody else? No. Good. She frowned. You believe me? Caleb settled the hat low over his eyes. Miss Marrow, I've known liars my whole life. They spend more time explaining than remembering. Outside, the rider across the street turned his horse and moved away too quickly. Caleb watched him go. Then he looked back at Lydia. We're going to get those papers tonight. Her face tightened. My ankle will hurt. Silas will have men there, probably. And you're still going? Caleb opened the clinic door. That gate already cost me one lie today. I'm not picking it back up. By moonrise, the road north of Messia had cooled just enough to fool the skin. The ground still held the day's heat. Lydia rode beside Caleb, with her bandaged foot tied lightly in the stirrup, so it would not swing. Every rut hurt. She hid most of it. Caleb noticed all of it. Old gunmen noticed things. That was usually why they became old. The cottonwoods around Marrow Spring came into view near midnight. No lamps burned in the bunkhouse. One pale light glowed in the main house. That should have comforted him. It did not. Too much quiet always felt arranged. Caleb stopped short of the ranch yard and crouched near the trail. Fresh tracks crossed the dust. 4 horses, 1 wagon. Heavy men by the depth of the heel marks, not ranch hands. Silas? Lydia whispered. Caleb shook his head. Silas is loud. These men were paid to be quiet. That scared her more. Good. Fear can be useful when it tells the truth. They tied the horses behind the barn and crossed toward the spring house on foot. The building was small, built of stone and wood, with a sloped roof and a pump pipe running through the floor into the cold dark below. Lydia touched the doorframe. For a moment, pain left her face and grief replaced it. "My father built this himself." Caleb said nothing. Some places do not need commentary. Inside, moonlight fell through the cracks in thin blue lines. The air smelled of wet stone, iron, and old dust. Lydia limped toward the pump shelf. Caleb stayed at the door. He saw the cigarette ember first, a tiny red bead glowing near the watering trough outside. Still fresh. "Move fast," Caleb whispered. Lydia pried at the loose stone. Outside, a boot shifted in gravel. Then the spring house door slammed inward. A man with a shotgun stepped into the doorway. Harlan Pike. Broken nose, thick neck, eyes like a dog that had learned to bite for praise. "Well now," Pike said. The hero came back thirsty. 2 more men moved behind him, with revolvers drawn. Caleb's hand drifted near his Colt. Pike smiled. "I wouldn't." From behind the pump shelf, Lydia gasped. Clara's voice rose in the dark. "She found it!" Caleb moved anyway. Age slows a man's knees. Experience sharpens his timing. The first hired gun fired too fast. Caleb dropped sideways and drew in the same motion. 1 man fell against the wall. Pike charged before Caleb could turn. They hit the pump shelf hard enough to crack wood. Pain burst through Caleb's shoulder. Pike drove a fist into his ribs. "You should have stayed a road ghost," Pike snarled. Caleb grabbed the iron pump handle and drove it into Pike's stomach. The big man folded. Caleb struck him again across the jaw. Pike dropped beside the water pipe, groaning into the dust. But then Caleb heard the sound every gunman hates most, a hammer cocking behind someone else's ear. Silas Creed stood in the corner with Lydia pulled against him, his wounded hand wrapped in a bloody rag, his revolver pressed beneath her jaw. Lydia clutched an oilskin packet against her chest. She had found the papers. Silas smiled through swollen lips. "Look at that," he said. "The little keeper of records finally became useful." Caleb went still. Not calm, still. There is a difference. Then another voice came from the doorway. "Careful with the packet, Silas. Paper burns easier than people." Horace Venn stepped into the moonlight in a clean, dark coat, silver watch chain bright against his vest. He looked at the broken boards, the fallen hired man, Pike on the floor, Caleb bleeding from the mouth. Then he looked at Lydia and smiled politely. "Some men are made uglier by good manners." "Miss Marrow," Venn said, "you have caused a remarkable amount of inconvenience." Lydia's voice shook with rage. "You're stealing my father's ranch." Venn sighed, as if correcting a child. Business always sounds cruel when spoken by people who do not understand it. Caleb nearly shot him for that sentence alone. Almost. Venn held out one gloved hand. The packet. Silas shoved the gun harder against Lydia's throat. "Give it over." Caleb watched him. Silas was sweating too much. Packet. Silas shoved the gun harder against Lydia's throat. "Give it over." Caleb watched him. Silas was sweating too much. His eyes kept flicking toward Venn. There it was. Silas thought he was a partner. Venn saw him as a tool. Tools get discarded when they cut the wrong hand. Lydia looked at Caleb. not pleading, waiting. Silas made one mistake. He glanced toward the window when a horse outside stamped. Half a second. That was all Lydia needed. She slammed the oilskin packet upward into Silas's broken hand. The revolver fired into the ceiling. Everything moved at once. Caleb drove his shoulder into Silas and smashed him through the door frame into the yard. Pike lunged for the shotgun. Lydia grabbed the cracked pump handle with both hands and swung it like an axe. It caught Pike across the wrist. He howled. Caleb hit Silas in the ribs, then the jaw. Silas drew a knife from his boot and slashed across Caleb's sleeve. Caleb answered with a short punch to the throat. Silas folded into the dust. Inside the spring house, another shot roared. Then silence. Lydia came out, holding Pike's shotgun, smoke curling from the barrel, her face white but steady. Pike lay groaning inside, clutching his shoulder. Caleb looked at her. She looked back at her. She looked back. "Doctor said I shouldn't stand too long," she whispered. Caleb breathed out a rough little laugh. "Seems you listened poorly." Then the smile vanished. Horace Venn was gone. So was the oilskin packet, and in the dust beyond the trough, fresh hoof marks cut south toward Messia. By sunrise, Caleb Rourke was sitting in a jail cell. That was how the West often worked. The man with blood on his sleeve sat behind iron. The man with stolen papers changed coats and visited the sheriff first. Sheriff Tom Garrity was not a corrupt man. That would have been simpler. He was tired. Tired men can be just as dangerous because they stop reaching for truth once paperwork gets heavy. "You fired shots on private property," Garrity said. Caleb leaned against the cell wall. Private property was the argument. The sheriff scowled. Horace Venn stood near the desk, with a bruise on one cheek and clean documents in his hand. "Mr. Rourke is a drifter with a violent history," Venn said. "Miss Marrow is grieving. Her sisters can confirm she has been unstable since her father's passing." Caleb stared at him. Venn knew his name, his real name, not the road name he had used for years. That meant Venn had asked questions. Money always did. Sat by the stove, pencil still in one hand. Ansel braid, gray mustache, round spectacles, a face built from suspicion and coffee. He had watched Caleb since dawn. Finally, he said, "You wore a deputy marshal's badge once." Caleb did not answer. Sheriff Garrity looked up. "That true?" Ansel nodded. "New Mexico Territory, before the rail camp killings." The room went quiet. Old ghosts have a way of entering without opening doors. Then the office door burst inward. Lydia Marrow stepped inside, or tried to. Her ankle almost failed before she caught the door frame. Behind her came a weathered ranch hand named Mateo Soria, gray-bearded and furious at being ignored. "She ordered me to bring her," Mateo said. "I argued. I lost." Lydia held a folded letter in one hand. "I need to speak before Mr. Venn finishes lying." The sheriff stood. Venn's smile thinned. Lydia handed Garrity the letter. "My father wrote this before he died." The room settled into a hard silence while the sheriff read. His expression changed only a little. "Enough. He says Silas Creed borrowed against the spring," Garrity muttered. "Says Venn pressured him to sell water access for the rail spur." Lydia nodded. "He says the real will and ledger are hidden at the ranch." Venn stepped forward. "That letter proves nothing except paranoia." Then Ruth Marrow appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes were red, and for the first time since Caleb had seen her, she looked less cruel than cornered. Clara stood behind her, then did not turn. "Choose your words carefully," he said. "False testimony carries consequences." That was his mistake. Selfish people will follow evil a long way, but they hate being spoken to like servants. Ruth lifted her chin. Silas forced Lydia, then froze. Sheriff Garrity lowered the letter. Ruth swallowed hard. "He said if she signed, we could keep shares after the sale. He said nobody would care what happened to her. He said the spring mattered more than she did." Clara began crying. Not prettily, not usefully, but truthfully. "She never agreed," Clara whispered. "None of it was willing." For 1 second, the whole room changed shape. Not enough to heal anything, enough to begin. Then Silas Creed crashed through the back door with a revolver in his good hand. He grabbed Lydia around the chest and dragged her against him, the barrel pressed beside her head. "Nobody move." Caleb stepped to the bars. "Silas." The man's eyes were wild now. Money and lies can keep a man standing for a while, not forever. Silas backed toward the street, pulling Lydia with him. "If I can't have that spring," he shouted, "nobody will." Then he shoved her into a waiting freight wagon and whipped the horses south. Sheriff Garrity unlocked Caleb's cell before the dust had settled. "Make me regret this," he said, "and I'll shoot you myself." Caleb took his gun belt. Fair. Outside, Messiah had gone still. People watched from shaded porches as the wagon tracks cut south toward the river flats. Ansel Braid came out of the office carrying a Winchester. Caleb looked at him. "You coming?" The old newspaper man shrugged. "I hate missing endings." Mateo brought 3 horses. They rode hard. The trail followed the dry wash toward an abandoned pump station where a narrow rail spur had once been surveyed and forgotten. Caleb understood the direction before the sheriff did. Silas was not just running. He was going to burn the ranch records, kill Lydia, and make the whole thing look like a desperate woman died in a fire she started herself. Then would call it tragedy. The court would call it confusion. The spring would change hands by winter. By late afternoon, they saw black smoke rising near the cottonwoods. Not camp smoke, oil smoke. Caleb pushed his horse faster. The station sat near a bend in the Rio Grande, half stone, half rotted timber, with rusted pipes stacked beside a dry loading platform. Silas had stopped the wagon there. Lydia was tied near the wheel. Her face was bruised. Her dress was torn again. But when she saw Caleb riding in, her eyes changed, not to fear, to recognition. Silas saw it, and that made him hate her more. Horace Venn stood by his horse, with the oilskin packet under one arm. For the first time, he looked afraid. Good. Rich men often keep their courage until violence asks them to pay cash. "This was not our agreement," Venn snapped at Silas. Silas laughed with no humor left in him. Agreements are for men who still have choices. He grabbed a lantern from the wagon bed. Caleb saw the plan in one glance. Oil on the station floor, records in Venn's hands, Lydia tied beside dry timber, a story waiting to be told by the only men left alive. Sheriff Garrity raised his revolver. "Put it down." Silas pressed his gun to Lydia's head. The sheriff stopped. Wind moved through the cottonwoods. Water slid slow and brown along the riverbank. Caleb did not watch the gun. He watched Silas's thumb. Too high on the hammer. Bad grip. Pain in the wounded hand. Panic in the breath. Old gunfighters do not look where bullets are. They look where fear is. Old gunfighters do not look where bullets are. They look where fear is. Caleb lowered his rifle to the ground. The sheriff hissed, "Rourke." Caleb ignored him. "Silas," he said softly, "you don't want this." Silas's mouth twisted. "Yes, I do." "No," Caleb said, "you just forgot how to stop." For 1 second, Silas hesitated. One crack in the door. Lydia drove her bound hands upward into Silas's wounded wrist and threw her weight sideways. The gun fired wild. Caleb moved before the echo died. Not fast like a young man, exact like an old one. He tackled Silas into the mud beside the river. The lantern flew free and shattered in wet sand. Ven ran for his horse. Ansel Braid stepped from behind the wagon, with Pike's recovered shotgun leveled at Ven's chest. "Don't make me print your obituary," Ansel said. Ven stopped. Silas fought like a cornered animal. Fear gives ugly strength. Caleb had something colder. Practice. He blocked the knife hand, drove one knee into Silas's ribs, and struck him once across the jaw. Then again. Then no more. Sheriff Garrity clamped irons on Silas, hard enough to make the chain sing. For several seconds, no one spoke. Only the river moved. Lydia sat in the dust by the wagon wheel, while Mateo cut the rope from her wrists. Her ankle trembled. Her hands shook. But nobody pushed her down. Nobody told her to sign. Nobody called fear by a gentler name. Ven's oilskin packet was opened on the wagon board in front of the sheriff. The will was there. The water ledger was there. So was Josiah Marrow's account book, with Silas Creed's debt written in a dead man's careful hand. Ven looked smaller without lies around him. Most men do. It took months for the courts to return everything properly to Lydia Marrow. That is another thing folks forget about justice. It may arrive with a gunshot, but it usually finishes with ink. Horace Ven lost his office before winter. Silas Creed went to Yuma in chains. Ruth left the territory and did not write back. Clara stayed in town doing laundry near the plaza, which was more honest work than she had done in years. As for Marrow Spring Ranch, it survived. Barely. The fences leaned, the roof leaked. The horses were thin. Half the east pasture looked like God had taken a rake to it. But the spring still ran cold under the stone house, and that mattered. A few weeks later, Caleb stood in the ranch yard mending the same gate he had opened with a gun on his hip. The chain was gone now. Lydia stepped onto the porch with a cane in one hand and a ledger under the other arm. She still limped. She still carried bruises that had faded from purple to yellow. But she stood in her own doorway like a person who had finally remembered the house belonged to her. "You missed a nail," she called. Caleb looked down. She was right. He shook his head. 46 years old and corrected by a woman who was supposed to be helpless. Lydia smiled. Only by fools. Caleb leaned on the fence and looked out toward the cottonwoods. Evening light burned copper across the water. For the first time in years, he did not feel the old need to saddle before sunrise. That did not mean he would stay forever. Men like Caleb rarely promised forever. But that evening, the road looked less hungry than usual. Maybe peace is not forgetting what you have done. Maybe it is finding one place where your soul can stop running long enough to repair a gate. Caleb Rourke did not save the whole territory. He did not end greed. He did not cure cowardice. He did not become young again. He opened one locked gate. He helped one woman stand. He made one lie answer to daylight. And sometimes that is enough. Because the world does not turn ugly all at once. It turns ugly every time a decent person decides a locked gate is somebody else's problem. That day, Caleb chose otherwise, and because he did, the water at Marrow Spring kept running.